Good morning. I'm Haley Hovius, President of the Nashville Healthcare Council. I'd like to thank all of you for starting your day with us for this discussion on employment law in our new pandemic world. I would also like to thank all of our community partners for participating on this collaboration. On the previous slides and in the chat, you should see a list of all the organizations that came together to bring you today's event. The Council is honored to be joining forces with such a wonderful group of organizations to promote vaccine adoption in our community. Please stay tuned for other programs and campaigns as the vaccine becomes more widely available to a larger population. Our goal is that everyone will have a chance to have a vaccine and will gladly decide to take one. Thank you for being a part of this. And now I'm pleased to introduce today's moderator. Jane Allen is the CEO of the Nashville Entrepreneur Center. Prior to joining the EC, Jane founded Council on Call before selling the company and joining its board. Jane joined the EC as CEO in 2019 and has made a significant impact on the system for Nashville's entrepreneurial ecosystem. As a lawyer herself, I can't imagine anyone better positioned to lead today's discussion on employment law in the pandemic. And Jane, I will turn it over to you. Jane, I think you're muted.
I am still muted. There we go. You know, it's been a year and here we are. It still happens. But anyway, I just want to say thank you, Haley, and thank you all for asking me to participate today. And all I really want to do is to allow these three amazing lawyers to have the time to share knowledge and information with all of you. I want to thank each and every one of them for saying yes when asked, not only for this, but for other things, because they really have been helpful to our community through this past year. And so first, I want to say a welcome to Martha Boyd, who is a partner and shareholder at Baker Donaldson, and then also Mary Lee Pirtle, who is a member at Bass, Berry & Sims, and then Matt Lonergan, a partner at Bradley A. Rant Bolt Cummings, LLP. So with that, I will let them talk as they're answering questions, and you'll get to know them through answering. But I thought there's so much to cover. We'll just jump right in. I do want you all to know, please feel free to ask questions. And then Kim, if you help me, if I don't see them, if you'll just make sure just to flag me, and then I'll be sure to get the questions asked so that everyone can get answers. Today, we have a mixed group. We have lawyers on the call. We also have business owners. We have people that run organizations. And so I thought before we jump in, you know, maybe it's the old school teacher in me, but taking a step back and just talking about where you all go for guidance. You know, I always say the law is gray. Otherwise, you probably won't need us, or back when I was a lawyer. But at the same time, I do think it's important. So where you all go for guidance, especially in a year like the one we've just had. And so Martha, can you jump in and answer that? And then if others want to add on, that would be great too.
Sure. So there are a variety of employment laws that we all look to for guidance, and those laws include the Family and Medical Leave Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And prior to the pandemic, we would look at the statute itself to see if we could find guidance we needed in the statute. We would often look at case law interpreting various provisions of that statute. So, you know, very, very rarely is it the case where you can look at the statute and find the answer to a client question. You don't typically have to analogize or, you know, say, well, this is sort of like this, and I look at this case law, and this is held this way. And then the other source would be regulations. So the Department of Labor issues regulations that are helpful to us. And so when we're interpreting employment laws, we look at all of those sources. We also have guidance from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So it doesn't have the force of law, but courts often use it and say, well, the EEOC believes this is this way, and so we're going to interpret the law that way. But it's not law, so it is guidance only. We also have the case law from the National Labor Relations Board, which has been all these laws have been sort of influential in the pandemic, as we have looked at, for example, early in the pandemic, a lot of employers said, can we take employee temperatures? And under the Americans with Disabilities Act, at the beginning of the pandemic, the answer to that question was no, that's a medical exam, and you're not allowed to do a medical exam of your employees. There was some guidance from the Department of Labor that said during a pandemic you can, but it wasn't, this thing wasn't yet declared a pandemic. The EEOC finally did come around and say it is okay to take your employee temperatures. And then we had the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, and we got regulations that accompanied that act. And they were done in a question and answer format so that you could sort of see, what is my question? You could look at it and see what the Department of Labor said. And then the Department of Labor would add to those regulations over time as additional questions arose. So that's sort of the panoply of laws and regulations and guidance that we've been looking at throughout this pandemic. And that's why often when we get a question from a client, it's not just a straightforward yes or no. It requires us to do a little digging and analogizing and analysis into all those various sources.
Right, thank you. Mary Lee?
Yeah, and just to echo some additional guidance that was unusual for at least my area was the CDC and all of the guidance that the CDC was putting forth, which, you know, as we all know, seemed to change from week to week sometimes. And then added to that was state level guidance from state health departments. And of course, you know, all of these roadmaps to reopening and certain standards that the state set forth that they expected employers to abide by as they kind of decided whether to return to work, how soon, and certainly which specific industries should remain open versus those who had to be closed. So that was kind of another added layer that you know, we weren't used to having to deal with when we were answering these type of questions.
Right, thank you. And Matt?
I think the difficulty that we would have experienced as lawyers in this is covering all those different areas. You look at the federal level, the state level, and then, you know, Metro National was a prime example of different regulations, the definition of who was vulnerable and what you were supposed to do or not do as a vulnerable person was really in direct conflict with some of the provisions like the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so we had to try and advise our clients that you can do this, but we got to be concerned about this. And I think when we all three talked the other day, we were all pleasantly surprised by the responsiveness and almost employer-friendly attitude that these agencies exhibited, which is not their normal mode of conduct, so to speak. But that's the part that I think was difficult, is making sure, and then a lot of times it's just giving it our best guess as to what would work or what would not fly.
No, that's great. Thank you. And then speaking of regulatory and to piggyback a little bit about what Matt said, a question is, what has surprised you during this year? You know, what has been some of your biggest surprises as you know, let's think back, guys, a year ago today. Who would have thought we'd be talking about this today? But what a crazy year it's been. And so I think that's what, when you think back, like, what has surprised you during this year? Other than the obvious pandemic and everybody being sent home. I mean, you know, other than the obvious.
Well, I would say that I've been really surprised by my clients' abilities to really just flex and adapt and continue to operate a business in a viable manner with all the challenges they're facing. So they have, as Mary Lee pointed out, we got all this guidance from the CDC and state agencies at the beginning regarding how to set up your workplace if you're going to continue operating, you know, putting in dividers between employees and making your employees wear masks and should they wear respirators and all this various guidance that we got. And our clients were really able to, you know, keep it going. I mean, you know, operate safe workplaces and ensure they had issues with employees coming to work sick, but they were able to put into place new policies that said, don't come to work sick. And they were able to take this, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act and use it to their benefit. So I've been just, pleasantly surprised by my clients' ability to say, you know what, we've got this, and we've helped them a lot with the policies and things, but they've been the ones implementing it, and they've done an amazing job.
Mary Lee?
Yeah, lots of people have referred to this as kind of the great work from home experiment that no one signed up for. And, it was just amazing how easily everyone kind of fell into step and were able to transfer their workforce to, a work from home remote system. I mean, if this happened 20 years ago, we would be having a completely different discussion. So I agree with that. I mean, I was very surprised at how well employees were able to work from home. And I'm surprised now how many of my clients especially are wanting to continue that moving forward, even, as the pandemic kind of comes to an end or lessens. And, just having everyone realize that this is really a viable option for their business, I think it's been a real surprise.
Great. Matt, did you want to add to that?
I think, I alluded to it a little bit earlier ago, but I think the responsiveness and the attitude of the agencies issuing the guidance memos and regulations, as someone who's been on the management side, L&E lawyer for my entire career, was surprising. And I think it was a recognition by the people behind those measurements as to this is something that we got to figure out how to deal with, and that behooves and treats everybody favorably, the employees, the employers, the companies, the management groups, because we're all in this together without a whole lot of history how to respond to these situations. So I was pleasantly surprised by that attitude, and it continues to exist as we appear to be getting on the backside of what we've been dealing with for a year.
All right, so, and Mary Lee alluded to it a little bit, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. And I think, I can only speak for myself, but I'm so darn excited. But with that comes challenges, or for you all, opportunities, because as an employer, now all of these new issues are coming up. And so that's what we want to spend the rest of today really focusing on, is the unrolling of what we've just experienced as we get back to the new normal. So I'm just going to go back. Historically, most job descriptions would have an essential function of the job be attendance in person. Now, Mary Lee, you mentioned it a little bit, but I would like you all to talk a little bit about, are you seeing employers that are continuing with the work from home? And then if they are, what new challenges or issues are they having to address? One thing that's come up just this week in talking to some people is, if we allow people to work from home, can we mandate that they actually sit in a certain room with a certain light and wear professional clothes? I think these are just fascinating issues. So I'm going to ask, maybe Matt, let's start with you, and then we'll work to Martha and Mary Lee as they have anything to add.
Sure. It's going to be a challenge. I think anybody who has signed a lease for commercial real estate and has 25% of their people only in the office, everybody working from home, there's a natural desire economically to bring people back in the fold, so to speak. But I think we are seeing more folks with adapting the remote work philosophy and realizing that they can be productive and engaged. And the challenges will be maintaining that productivity, and how much oversight does an employer feel comfortable exercising over their employees to maintain a morale situation and a productivity. I mean, does it really matter if you're working from home and you get out of your pajamas and put on your day sweats? Probably not, unless you're going to be doing Zoom meetings or a deposition by Zoom or a meeting appreciation, and you hope that people are responsible and professional enough to recognize that. But for the vast majority of folks that we have worked with, there's always been, you have to be on site, and it's an essential function of the job. And the pandemic has proven, well, maybe not, maybe not.
All right, Martha?
Yeah, so I think another challenge is going to be those folks who really haven't been as productive as you would have liked as an employer, and sort of saying, look, you know, you've kind of messed around for a year, but we need you to come back because, you know, this work from home thing is not working for you individually. And I think employers are going to really struggle because those employees may fight back and say, but I've been doing it for a year. Clearly I can. And the employer is going to have to say, but you haven't, your productivity has gone down. And hopefully the employer has some way to quantify that, right? Hopefully the employer has some way to say, you know, when I look at the productivity across the board, you're at the bottom. Or, you know, when I have tried to call you or email you, your responsiveness has not been there. You know, you've been calling me back 3 hours later or whatever. So I think employers are going to struggle with those one-offs that they decide, you know, although some people can remain working at home, we're going to have to bring some people back because the accountability just isn't there. And then how to deal with those. And of course, they may fight back and they may say, but I have a health condition or something. And so all those issues are going to be really challenging for employers going forward. But I think they need to start now planning who are those people and what do we need to do to quantify that their performance has been lacking.
Yes, could an employer say, you know, team camaraderie or community is essential? And yes, we've done this, but we want everyone back on site. Mary Lee?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think absolutely. If the employer wants everyone back on site and they believe that that's the best environment, just to, you know, face-to-face contact with coworkers, and that's where kind of you can brainstorm together and come up with the best ideas. I think an employer certainly can say that, even though they've allowed their employees to work from home over the past few months. And interestingly, the EEOC has already said in some of its guidance that if an employer has allowed an employee to, if they've excused an employee from the essential function of reporting to work because of the pandemic in an effort to slow or stop the spread, that's not going to be deemed a permanent excuse. You won't have permanently changed that job function. Now, of course, as time goes on and the pandemic lessens, that of course will play into all of that, whether or not you really have permanently removed work from or work reporting to work as an essential function of the position.
And then there is a comment made, we have made it mandatory to have your workplace approved. Productivity is measured, and if you fall below a certain percentage, you are then directed to return to the office, which is socially distance modified. And we've actually grown so much over this past year that we cannot bring everyone back now. So, I mean, there's obviously, to Martha's point, being able, and I do think it's so important to be able to measure productivity objectively, if at all possible, when people are working remotely. Mary Lee, did you want to add something?
Well, one interesting thing that I've already had come up is work from home bias. You know, before the pandemic, everyone, you know, I don't know if, you know, it was kind of rare for people to be working from home. And there was a bit of a stigma surrounding it that, oh, you're just sitting around all day in your pajamas, or you're, you know, not really doing much, or, you know, yeah, are you really working from your cabin in the woods? Or are you really working from the beach? Kind of a stigma around it. And I think that has gone away. But as people move back into kind of a hybrid model, I've already had this come up with a client where they've had managers who seem to be treating people who show up to the office differently than those who are still working from home, even though the company has allowed people to elect whether they want to return or work from home. And, you know, I think just to be careful that some of that bias isn't kind of trickle back in, and that, management is trained to treat everyone the same and, really hold everyone to kind of the same standards. I think that's going to become a little bit difficult as people kind of move back into the office.
And we're having a few questions on the vaccine, and I was going to get there in a little while, but why don't we just jump to it? On the way in this morning, I heard on the radio, Bridgestone is now paying people, and their employer and their employees, if they get the vaccine. So one question is, can we require everyone to get the vaccine? Martha?
Well, so that's a complicated question. The answer we have been given by the EEOC is yes, that employers can require their employees to get the vaccine. There is some concern right now that because the current vaccines are approved under an emergency use authorization approval by the FDA, there are some people who are concerned that mandating under that EUA is not appropriate, because there's a provision in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that says employees can't be required to take people can't be required to take a vaccine approved under an EUA. But the EEOC has told us, yes, there are lots and lots of reasons why that may not be a good idea, but the technical answer is yes. And I'll let some of my colleagues address the myriad of issues that will arise if you do mandate it. I've had one employer so far who is mandating it, and we haven't even rolled out the mandate yet, and we're already seeing all the many potholes in the process.
Mary Lee?
Well, one of the kind of pitfalls is that you're going to have some type of mechanism for employees to opt out of receiving the vaccine for religious reasons, or if they suffer from some disability, such as kind of adverse reaction to a vaccine or an allergy to a vaccine component, even severe anxiety related to potential side effects could even potentially be a disability. So you can't it's not as easy as saying we want everyone to be vaccinated or requiring everyone to be vaccinated. You have to have a program that allows for employees for those reasons to kind of opt out. And it's a difficult undertaking, especially when you have a large amount of employees. You can imagine that that's going to take a lot of resources to kind of handle all of those exemption requests.
Matt, do you have anything to add?
I would just, to piggyback to Mary Lee's comment, that process under the ADA or Title VII for religious objections to the vaccines will require employers to see if they can make a reasonable accommodation. Can you do something other than absolutely requiring the employee who objects on those grounds to continue to work without getting a vaccine? And that's a fact by fact, case by case basis that requires a pretty deep dive on analysis. But the end of the day is, if they're not a religious objection or an ADA disability related concern, you can require the vaccine.
I think Kimberly has asked a really good question, and I've wondered this even with travel. Under the CDC guidelines, allowing vaccinated individuals to meet in person without wearing masks, like how do you as an employer, actually her question's better than mine. How do you govern this? Meaning, can you ask an employee if they have been vaccinated and provide evidence of this?
Well, you can ask them if they've been vaccinated, and you can ask them to provide evidence. But right now, the CDC has said that individuals who've been vaccinated can relax the mask requirement, or mask recommendation around, one family member from outside of your home or whatever. They have not said that employers can start to relax the mask recommendation at work. So right now, I think the safest thing to do is to treat all of your employees the same in terms of social distancing, mask wearing, until we get some guidance from the CDC that says, okay, employers, now it is safe to allow your employees who've been vaccinated to, not do all these things that we've been requiring them to do. And Jane, I want to go back to the question about the vaccine mandate. Just
Sure.
Another major reason why I think it's a bad idea to mandate it is and I want all employers, as they're thinking about, I'm going to mandate this vaccine, to think about, what if your very best employee, the one that you just, is the most productive, she's the best, she has all the relationships, what if she says, I'm not getting it? Are you going to fire her? Because if you don't, then your mandate is meaningless, right? And if you do, you've just lost a great employee. Is it really going to be worth it to you to do that? My thought is that employers who say, we strongly recommend the vaccine, we encourage you to get it, here's the CEO, a picture of the CEO getting his, at the Music City Center or whatever, encourage it, but without mandating it. I think you will have a better response from employees who feel like, my employer has trusted me to make a decision about my own body, and I'm not comfortable getting it today, but maybe they see all their coworkers get it and they see that their coworkers feel a little more secure, and maybe they go get it. So that's another, I guess, plug in my view for not mandating it, but encouraging it.
All right, so now let's take it a little step further. So we don't mandate it, and now you have employees that'll say, I don't feel safe coming back into the office because not everyone's vaccinated. There is a question that's been asked, what happens when you've done everything that you can as an employer to make a safe workplace, and you still have employees that say, I don't feel safe coming back into the workplace? And, is that ADA? Is it, what I'm saying? Like, are we going to be looking at disability there? Matt, do you want to take that?
Sure. I think you touched on, Jane, a general response that I don't feel safe, but they don't have a reason attached to it, like a disability related condition or the religious objections. The general, I don't feel safe and I'm not coming back to work, isn't going to protect an employee from adverse action. That the employer would have the right to say, absent some qualifying condition that would entitle you to legal protection or reasonable accommodation, we're going to, mandate you come back to work. And if you don't, then we'll deal with it from there. So, but if the employee does have a valid basis for not returning to work at this point because his or her concerns about their disability or not have to be accommodated, then the employer is going to have to work through that process and ultimately figure out at some point, if they've exhausted their ability to offer a reasonable accommodation and the employee is still not willing to come to work, then the employer is entitled to take the action it thinks is appropriate to address the issue, which could ultimately result in somebody's termination.
And then Nathan has asked a good question. Can an employer require an employee who chooses not to get the vaccine to sign some sort of liability waiver? There is some interest in this, especially with companies that have customer-facing employees.
As a general rule, employers having employees sign, and I got this question a lot at the beginning of the pandemic, can an employer just, have the employees all say, we waive any right to sue or seek, make a work comp claim because we get sick at work? And the answer to that is generally no. Workers have a right, if they get sick at work, to file a workers' compensation claim. That claim may or may not be paid based on workers' compensation law, but they have a right to do it. I don't know of any court that is going to allow an employer to have employees waive any claims they might have based on not getting the vaccine. That's just typically not going to be enforced by a court.
All right. Should employers treat, and these are questions I've been, should employers treat employees who have a vulnerable family member living in their home who has a health condition that makes them more vulnerable to COVID differently in terms of the return to work policies that you put in place? Mary Lee, you want to take that?
You're on my end, the audio cut out a little bit at the beginning, and I didn't hear the beginning. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. Should employers that have employees who have elderly or people living in their home that are more susceptible to COVID, should and can they treat them differently than employees who do not, as far as having people return back to work?
Well, it depends on if they would qualify under the FMLA, for leave, I guess. I mean, no, the short answer is I don't recommend you treat people differently. I mean, you're certainly able to, if someone says, I've got this situation and, I would prefer to work from home. If you're offering alternative work arrangements, then sure, you could let that person work from home a little bit longer. It's different if they are qualifying under FMLA, to where you will be required to allow them to have some type of leave. And that's different than allowing them to work from home, of course. Under the FMLA, that's an unpaid leave of absence. So it really kind of depends on what the circumstances and what your policy is. If you have everyone come back, are you going to allow that one person to continue to work from home? That you'll have to deal with that on a case-by-case basis, I guess, if you want to bend your policy for that. And then versus the pool of FMLA, where you would need to provide that person with, if they're caring for someone with a serious health condition, allow them to have some leave or time off from work.
Matt?
Yeah, the vulnerable person situation is really interesting, because that is truly a heads, tails question, because you get the vulnerable person who does not want to come back to work, and you get the employer who doesn't want the vulnerable person to come back to work for risk of infection. And then the employee says, no, I want to come in. I miss my teammates. I miss the atmosphere. I want to work on site. And the employer pushes back and says, well, no, you're 72 and you've got diabetes and you're high risk category. And so the ADA comes right into play there, as does the Age Discrimination in Employment Act. If you're telling people to stay home because they're in an age-based category, you've got an issue to deal with.
Anyone else? No. Okay. All right, then let's ask another question. As we know, Nashville has been a lot of people moving here from California, from Chicago, from everywhere, and a lot of those people are still working for their employers in other states. As you all look at the work from home, and Mary Lee, you mentioned earlier, some employers are saying it's working fine, you can stay working from home. Are there any issues? I mean, should you know where your employee is actually living? Assuming they're getting their job done, assuming their productivity is high, do you really care?
Yeah, Jane, I've had this issue arise several times, and this goes to having a good work from home policy that requires that before an employee is allowed to work from home, they need to get approval from the employer. And part of that approval should be, where is that place they're working from? So a couple of things: you don't want your employees working from a coffee shop where their work could be viewed or listened to by others. And you don't want an employee working from a place that you didn't know they were working. And that could be, say, California, for example. As Matt and Mary Lee, I think will chime in, California has all sorts of employment laws that we don't want our employers to be subject to unless they have employees there and it's a conscious decision on their part. And there are other states similar. So before you have an employee who's allowed to work from home, you need to know where they are, where they're working from, and then what obligations that imposes on you as an employer, because you may need to be paying state employment taxes on that person. You may need to sign them up for workers' compensation coverage. You certainly need to pay into unemployment tax in those states. And, you may be subject to having an establishment in one of those states because inadvertently you now have you're running a business out of that state. So it's real important that employers be aware of where their employees are doing that work.
And so what if somebody's going just during the pandemic, I'm going to go live with my brother in California for 3 months? Would that still be the same as if they moved there?
California is really aggressive about enforcing people working in California. They're really aggressive. Like you can go to California for a week and do work there. And the California Department of Labor may come after you and say, you got to start paying employment taxes and all this other stuff. So I would be really wary about allowing somebody to move to California to work for you, even if it's just 3 months. That seems, de minimis in our minds, but the California Department of Labor is one of those that's really aggressive on that point.
Mary Lee?
Yeah, and it opens you up to all sorts of wage and hour issues as well. I mean, different states have different meal and rest break requirements, especially California. Overtime issues. I mean, the overtime laws differ between states. So, I mean, there's other issues just to be mindful of. Another one that has come up, and it's not necessarily between states, is, I guess it could be depending on exemptions, but are you jeopardizing exemptions in your modified job descriptions? Because everyone just scrambled at the beginning of this and here, go work from home, and this is what I'll have you do at home. Maybe you can't do all of your set job duties, so I'm going to modify your job a bit. And they've modified it, and now it's becoming kind of a more permanent requirement. And have you jeopardize your exemptions by modifying those job duties? And do you need to revisit whether or not that employee is properly classified as an exempt employee? Maybe it was at a manager and who was clearly an exempt employee, but now they're performing more and more non-exempt duties because they're having to work from home. Is that person properly classified as an exempt employee now? And certainly different states have different exemption requirements. So you want to be mindful of that too, if you do have that person working in California or Pennsylvania or wherever.
All right, and then someone responded, I like the question. We have a whole team on a telecommuting agreement that lists their address, the terms of working from that address with our equipment assigned to them. And then another, isn't it on HR to be competent at handling workers in all states and globally too? Seems like an essential value the HR should provide to the organizations.
Well, they can't provide that if they don't know where their folks are. So, and again, it's an employer's choice whether to have employees in other states or not. And certainly to have employees in California, as Mary Lee pointed out, in California, there's a lot of requirements that an employer may not have signed up for at the beginning. So if you have a Tennessee employer who has employees, let's say in Tennessee and Kentucky, those laws are pretty similar. Very minor differences in like meals and rest breaks and things like that, but otherwise it's pretty much the same. But having an employee in Massachusetts or California or one of the states that has pretty stringent and much more robust employment laws, HR isn't going to know that they have to even contemplate that. It needs to be an employer decision, a conscious decision. Do we want to have an employee in these states? And if so, we'll beef up on employment laws in those states.
And then if we plan to return to a hybrid work arrangement, do you recommend having employees sign a telecommuting agreement? And if so, are there any templates available?
I'll address that first part. Whether you call it a telecommuting or remote work policy, I do think it's appropriate to have employees sign. There is a policy in place and they sign off on the policy acknowledging what the terms are. And one of those critical terms would be the employer reserves the right to revoke a telecommute or remote work assignment based upon business needs or changes in circumstances. And as we mentioned early this morning, productivity. It's not a free rein for the employee to stay home and continue to work if they're not meeting the requirements of their job. And so having them sign off on that and having the ability of the employer to control the situation, I think it is critical to managing the remote workforce that a lot of employers now find themselves faced with that a year ago would have thought maybe you deal with 1 or 2 a year. Now that it's flipped, you're dealing with a vast majority of employees, many of whom have said, I like this new arrangement. I'll come to the office as needed or for a meeting, but the rest of the time I would like to work from home.
I think a little bit to Mary Lee's point, but I mean, we were doing this years ago at the company I started. And one thing you realize is, oh my God, they've got computers and they're going into a coffee shop. And so like even the telecommuting agreement or the remote work agreement address things such as the equipment and where they can keep the equipment and where they could use the equipment. You know, so it is a little, I think it's definitely the future. Mary Lee or Martha, do you want to chime in? Because I do think it's, Grace, to your point, I think it is the future. And I think that would be one of the updates to employment handbook policies, but I'm going to let the experts speak on that a little bit more. Mary Lee?
Yeah, I agree that you should have some policy in place that sets forth what your expectations are, what requirements you have, especially dealing with productivity, where they should perform the work, you know, how you are going to police that's another question, if you're not actually doing Zoom meetings and things like that. But, and there's other policies too. I mean, your entire handbook really should be revisited and reviewed with this new model in mind. If you're going to have a hybrid model or you're going to have really any employees working from home, I would make sure that your handbook is accounting for all that, whether it's, you know, confidentiality, just how they behave, how they're transmitting information. I mean, it really, most people's handbooks are drafted with everyone sitting at their desk in mind, in front of a computer where everyone's eyes are on each other, and just kind of revisiting it with a fresh perspective, I think would be advisable.
Martha?
Yeah, and even one, you know, I would draft employment work from home policies prior to the pandemic, and typically they said something like employees who are working from home should not be caretakers. They shouldn't be taking care of an elderly relative. They shouldn't be taking care of children. This is not a substitute for childcare. Post-pandemic, or at least starting at the beginning of the pandemic, we realized some of these employees, like, they're going to have to be at home with children either doing online school or, you know, they don't have school right now or something. So we had to modify that provision a little bit to say, you know, if you are taking care of children, you know, maybe you need to transfer your hours. So you're working with your child on school in the morning and you start working at noon and work till 8 p.m. instead of your normal schedule. So, so even to Mary Lee's point, even looking at these employment policies that you may have had a robust work from home policy before the pandemic, but you need to really consider certain things that may have changed in light of the pandemic.
Okay, and I'm going to go back and grab a question that Kim asked. I work with a nonprofit and we have 500 volunteers who provide lengthy face-to-face tutoring sessions. What can I legally require of our volunteers and the people they serve regarding vaccinations? What is my responsibility in protecting them? And am I allowed to enforce the, i.e., fire a volunteer? Good question, Kim.
I'll take a stab at it. It's a good question and causes me pause for concern. This may involve a little bit what Martha referred to earlier, which is the emergency use authorization for vaccines, and that individuals are not supposedly under the federal rule, not required or cannot be forced into having the vaccine. That may come into play because typically we're talking about as the employer-employee relationship, which is a different field. But if those folks are going to be face-to-face representing interaction with the constituents being served by the nonprofit, I'm going to say that you can establish a requirement that if it represents a significant threat of harm to the people they're serving because somebody's not vaccinated, may justify it. But I would treat it still like an employer situation, which is most folks are not going to mandate it. Certainly absent frontline healthcare workers, for most employment situations, it's not going to be mandated. And I'm not sure you would do it in a volunteer situation, because there's just a host of issues that come into play, maybe even more so than the employment environment.
Martha?
Yeah, I agree with that. And, you know, if you have a volunteer, say in a hospital, those volunteers are required to have like a TB time test and things like that to make sure they're safe to work with patients. And I would sort of look at it like that, like maybe this is going to be a requirement. But, you know, like if you're a volunteer, you can always opt out of volunteering. So if you do decide to make it a requirement, and maybe you wait until we have regular FDA approval, not EUA approval. But you know, I think it would be reasonable to say this is a requirement of being a volunteer here, but like you're a volunteer, so you can always opt out until you're more comfortable getting it, or until later on when the pandemic's over and we've relaxed that requirement.
You know, I'm going to go back. That feeds a little bit into going back to a prior question and looking at it from even a little different. But if I have employees who are customer facing and I know they didn't get the vaccine, and then a customer gets COVID, is there any liability on me as the employer?
So I've gotten this question a lot too since the beginning, and I think the answer is like potentially, but it's going to be so hard for a customer to prove that they got COVID from your employee that I think the chances of this happening are fairly slim. I mean, and to show that they got it from your workplace, they'd have to show your employee had it, your employee was contagious, I interacted with your employee, somebody wasn't wearing a mask, you know, I think that's going to be a hard sell. It's not that people aren't going to try to do it, but I think a plaintiff in a case like that has got a lot of challenges to try to show that you as a business are liable because they got COVID there. With certain diseases that where you could only get it one place, that might be more doable. But this is the kind of thing where it's so rampant in the community that it would be hard for you to show I got it from this one place and not from all these other places I was going.
And then another, what happens or changes when the FDA gives permanent authorization to the vaccination?
I'll try that. I'm not an expert on it, but my understanding is that then, and however long that process takes, my understanding is then that as that applies with a permanent approval, then the vaccine will be viewed as others that have been approved and can be required by certain institutions involving the people that work for them or just the general public, let's say. But I haven't done a deep dive on that, but I just understand there is a distinction between an emergency use authorization and the permanent approval, but the agencies over the employment arena have chosen to, to deviate from that or interpret their regulations differently and allow requirements subject to the caveats we talked about today.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting. I saw on the news that the military is vaccinating soldiers, but the vaccine is optional at this point. And I was a little surprised at that. When I was in the Army, there weren't any optional vaccines. But and I'm assuming that they're doing that because of the EUA authorization, because it's not full authorization. And I'm assuming that once the FDA grants full authorization for these vaccines, government institutions like the military will start mandating it. But we'll see. I'm interested to see. This is one of these evolving areas where we're sort of learning on the fly.
And then, can you require proof of vaccination in order to be hired? Mary Lee?
If you're going to have a mandatory vaccination program, then you could certainly require that. I mean, it would just be someone, I guess, submitting their vaccination card to you, just like you would require under your mandatory program. Again, I don't know that that's the best way to go at this point, but I think you certainly could do so just based on the EOC guidance at this point.
You're still going to have the caveats about if someone has an ADA, disability protected category, or religious objection to going through the reasonable accommodation process that would allow that person still to be hired, even though they haven't gotten the vaccine or don't intend to get the vaccine. So it's the same scenario you have to work through.
And then Haley has asked a question. Oh, go ahead, Martha.
You'd want to be careful in that process to make sure that your hiring managers don't say, oh, I'm going to have to deal with this ridiculous exemption, and so I'm not going to hire this person because they've told me they can't get the vaccine because of a medical condition. You want to make sure your hiring managers are aware that they can't discriminate on that basis and not hire somebody because they've said, I've got a medical issue that prevents me from getting it, or I've got a religious objection to the vaccine.
All right. And then Haley's asked a question, and it may be similar to the one that was asked just a moment ago, but for those of us who host large events, and as we start opening back up, is there a liability issue for people who come and attend the events and the spread of COVID?
I don't know that there's any more liability than there, previously has been. I mean, no one knows, right? I mean, this is kind of a area where we just still don't know. I mean, as long as you are doing everything, following the guidance, you've got social distancing, you have, to the extent you can, your hand washing stations, all the same things that everyone's been doing in the workplace. I mean, if you're doing the best you can, I mean, that's kind of what I tell everybody. I'm like, just do the best you can. I mean, there is no checklist of items to go through, and there's no perfect liability waiver that would work. And so it really just is not clear at this point.
I would add to that, that we have in Tennessee and some other states have enacted these kind of liability shield laws that basically say, as long as as Mary Lee points out, the best you can means follow the CDC guidelines, the WHO guidelines, your local regulations. And if I'm in the hospitality industry and I'm host a concert venue or large restaurant, if I'm doing those things that are required by the applicable regulations to maintain my operation and be open during a pandemic, then I think you're going to be generally protected. And as Martha said earlier, in that kind of venue, it's going to be almost impossible for someone to prove that they contracted COVID at the Ryman because the people serving bar had their mask off or something like that. So, or you get it from somebody else in the public. So it's a really big stretch to do that. But you've got to if you ignore all those requirements or regulations and don't do what you're supposed to, then could be a little different scenario.
Sure. And then we have one last, go ahead.
I will say that contrary to what I said earlier about you can't have employees waive claims against their employer, you certainly can have members of the public who are attending a conference enter into a waiver of claims. Whether that's going to be enforceable or not, as Mary Lee pointed out, we don't know. We haven't tried this, but at least you'll have something that says the attendee at your conference assume some of the risk of getting sick. And I think this is particularly good if you have a hybrid conference where you have some people able to participate online and others able to participate in person. And you're saying to your attendee, you've chosen to participate in person and you understand there's a little bit of a risk here and you're going to waive any claims you have against the conference host, you might actually be able to succeed on that waiver.
Now, I mean, that's honestly for our organization, I've just said everything will be hybrid for the foreseeable future. We're excited to have people back in person, but there's always going to be some who aren't comfortable or able to be in person. So hybrid is the new normal, I'm afraid, or not afraid. I mean, maybe it's better because then it's open to even more people. So, all right, one last question real quick for one. If you are the employer and you yourself are immune or compromised, what advice would you give to have the employees all get vaccinated so that you can come back to work? Mary Lee, you want to take that?
Well, I mean, it's the same analysis. I mean, whether you can mandate at this point and whether you should. I mean, in that case, I mean, if there's other less intrusive means, if social distancing's been working, or if there's other ways, I mean, you might want to consider that first. And with all of this, it depends on your workforce. Again, are you willing to let go of your star performer because they refuse to get vaccinated? Are you willing to lose all of your employees because they refuse to get vaccinated? I mean, where are you comfortable drawing that line? Are there other ways to do it? Could you offer incentives instead to hopefully drive up some interest? I mean, there's just a lot of considerations. I mean, again, the EEOC at least has said that you can mandate the vaccine subject to everything we've discussed. So that's really the same considerations.
All right, well, I just want to, we're running out of time. I hope the audience has found this helpful and beneficial. I know I have. And so thank you so much. I think that's one thing that makes Nashville so special, is that people really do come together. And again, I want to thank you on behalf of the nonprofit community, to each of you, Matt, Martha, and Mary Lee, for saying yes when we call and ask for you to meet with some of our clients and constituents, and you always say yes. And so thank you so much. I also want to acknowledge the support of all of our community partners for participating in this. And a big shout out to Haley, who actually, this was her brainchild and brought us all together. And again, I think that's one thing that makes Nashville so special, is we really do come together, and we're working hard to make Nashville come back to where it was, and then look forward to where it's going to go. In any event, I speak for all of us and truly appreciate your time, your experience, and your wisdom, and for sharing it with all of us this morning. So thank you, and have a great day.